What would you do if someone asked you to deliver a message that could shatter everything a young woman believed about her past? Today's story is about a prison chaplain who received the most difficult request of his 15-year ministry from a condemned woman with only hours left to live. What she asked him to do after her execution would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, mercy, and a mother's love. This isn't just another story about crime and punishment. This is about a choice that would haunt one man for 3 years, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary lengths a parent will go to protect their child. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want you to know that what you're about to hear will change how you think about the decisions we make when everything we love is at stake. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end, because this story has revelations that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. Let's begin with Father Michael Rodriguez, a soft-spoken man in his early 50s who had served as chaplain at Riverside State Correctional Facility for over a decade. Every morning he would walk through those heavy steel doors carrying his worn leather Bible and a thermos of coffee that would sustain him through another day of ministering to some of society's most forgotten souls. Father Michael wasn't like the fire and brimstone preachers you might expect to find in a prison. He was gentle, patient, and had this remarkable ability to see beyond the crimes that had brought these men and women to this place. Over the years, he had counseled murderers who wept for their victims, thieves who had found genuine redemption, and drug dealers who spent their final days trying to warn young people away from the paths they had chosen. But in all his years behind those walls, Father Michael had never encountered anyone quite like Maria Santos. Maria had been on death row for 8 years when Father Michael first met her. Unlike most inmates, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed untouched by the harsh realities of prison life. She was 35 years old, with dark hair that she kept neatly braided and eyes that held a depth of sadness that spoke of profound loss. Other inmates respected her. Guards spoke well of her. And yet, she was scheduled to die for the brutal murder of her husband. What made Maria's case so unusual wasn't just her exemplary behavior during her time on death row. It was the complete absence of any criminal history before the night that changed everything. Maria had been a devoted single mother, working 2 jobs to support her 7-year-old daughter Sophia after her first husband died in a car accident. She had never even received a speeding ticket. She volunteered at her daughter's school, helped elderly neighbors with their grocery shopping, and was known in her community as someone you could count on when times got tough. So how does a woman like that end up on death row for first-degree murder? That question had puzzled Father Michael from the moment he first read Maria's file. The answer, he would eventually learn, was both simpler and more complex than anyone could have imagined. 2 years after her first husband's death, Maria met David Thompson at a grief counseling group at their local church. David was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s who claimed to be a widower himself, struggling to rebuild his life after losing his wife to cancer. He was patient with Maria's grief, gentle with her daughter Sophia, and seemed to understand the challenges of single parenthood in a way that drew Maria to him like a lifeline. David was everything Maria had hoped to find. He remembered Sophia's favorite bedtime stories, helped with her homework, and took genuine interest in her dreams and fears. When he proposed after 18 months of careful courtship, Maria felt like she was finally getting her second chance at happiness. Sophia adored him, calling him Papa David. Within weeks of the wedding, and for the first time since her first husband's death, Maria allowed herself to believe in fairy tale endings. For 6 months, their blended family seemed perfect. David would arrive home from his job at a logistics company with small gifts for Sophia, stories about his day, and endless patience for a 7-year-old's endless questions. Maria would watch him helping Sophia with her art projects or reading to her before bed, and feel her heart swell with gratitude that life had given them both this unexpected blessing. But Maria's perfect life began to unravel on a Thursday evening in March, when she came home early from her shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. David wasn't expecting her for another 2 hours, and Maria found him in his home office with documents spread across his desk and a look of panic on his face when she appeared in the doorway. He quickly shuffled the papers into a folder, but not before Maria caught a glimpse of what looked like legal documents with a name that wasn't David Thompson. When Maria asked about the papers, David's explanation was vague and unconvincing. He claimed they were related to his deceased wife's estate, legal complications that he hadn't wanted to burden Maria with. But something in his eyes, a flicker of fear or guilt, made Maria's nursing instincts kick in. She had spent years learning to read people's faces for signs of pain or deception, and every fiber of her being told her that the man she had married was lying to her. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria began paying closer attention to the small inconsistencies in David's stories. Phone calls that he would take in private, stepping outside or moving to another room when his cell phone rang. Mail that would arrive, addressed to names she didn't recognize, which David would quickly explain as forwarding errors or junk mail. Computer sessions that he would hastily close when she entered the room, claiming he was just checking email or reading news. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when Maria decided to surprise David with breakfast in bed. She approached their bedroom quietly, carrying a tray of coffee and toast, and heard him speaking in low tones on his phone. Through the partially opened door, she heard him mention Sophia's name, followed by words that made her blood run cold. He was describing her daughter's physical development, her innocence, her trust in him, in terms that no stepfather should ever use. Maria set the tray down in the hallway with trembling hands and pressed her ear closer to the door. What she heard next would haunt her for the rest of her life. David was making plans with someone, discussing opportunities to be alone with Sophia, talking about gradually building her comfort level with physical contact. The conversation was coded, careful, but Maria's maternal instincts recognized the language of predation immediately. When David ended the call and emerged from the bedroom, he found Maria standing in the hallway, her face white with shock and growing horror. She confronted him immediately, demanding to know who he had been talking to and why he was discussing her daughter in such disturbing terms. David's reaction told her everything she needed to know. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally, a cold hardness that Maria had never seen before. That afternoon, while David was running errands and Sophia was at a friend's house, Maria did something that would change the trajectory of all their lives. She searched through David's personal belongings with the methodical thoroughness of someone whose child's safety depended on finding the truth. What she discovered in a locked box hidden in their closet made her realize that the man she had married, the man she had welcomed into her home and her daughter's life, was a stranger. Inside the box were multiple identification documents bearing David's photograph but different names. Driver's licenses from 3 different states, social security cards with various numbers, and most damning of all, court documents that revealed David's real identity and criminal history. His real name was James Robert Walsh, and he was a registered sex offender with convictions in 2 states for child sexual abuse. The dates on the court record showed that he had been released from his most recent prison sentence just months before joining the grief counseling group where he met Maria. Maria sat on their bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence that her husband was not just a liar, but a dangerous predator who had specifically targeted her and Sophia. The grief counseling group, the patient courtship, the gradual building of trust with her daughter, it had all been a carefully orchestrated plan to gain access to a vulnerable child. But the documents revealed something even more terrifying. James Walsh was supposed to be reporting to a parole officer in another state. He had violated the terms of his release by moving across state lines, changing his identity, and failing to register as a sex offender in their community. If Maria reported him to authorities, he would likely be arrested and returned to prison, but there was no guarantee that would happen quickly enough to protect Sophia. Predators like James were often skilled at disappearing when they sensed danger, and Maria realized that if he suspected she had discovered his true identity, he might act quickly to silence both her and Sophia. That evening, as Maria watched James interact with her daughter over dinner, she saw their relationship through completely different eyes. The way he positioned himself close to Sophia during homework time, the lingering hugs goodnight, the special games that he insisted they play when Maria wasn't around, it was all part of a grooming process that she had been too trusting to recognize. Maria lay awake that entire night, staring at the ceiling while James slept peacefully beside her. She knew she was facing an impossible choice. If she confronted him again, he might become violent, or simply disappear, potentially taking Sophia with him or harming them both before he left. If she tried to work through the legal system, the process could take weeks or months, during which time Sophia would remain vulnerable, and Maria would have to pretend that everything was normal. By morning, Maria had made the hardest decision of her life. She would protect her daughter the only way she knew how, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had ever worked for, everything she had ever dreamed of, and ultimately, her own life. What Maria Santos did next would land her on death row, but it would also ensure that her daughter would never become another victim of the man who had deceived them both. The plan Maria formed was simple in its desperation and devastating in its consequences. She would wait for an opportunity when Sophia was safely away from the house, confront James with the evidence of his true identity, and force him to leave their lives forever. If he refused or threatened them in any way, Maria was prepared to do whatever it took to protect her child, regardless of the cost to herself. That opportunity came 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening when Sophia was spending the night at her best friend's house. Maria had been counting down the hours, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, as she tried to maintain the facade of normalcy. James seemed to sense that something was different about her behavior, but he attributed it to work stress and was actually more attentive than usual, which only made Maria's skin crawl as she thought about his real motivations. After dinner, Maria asked James to join her in the living room for what she said would be an important conversation about their family's future. James settled into his favorite chair with a cup of coffee, expecting perhaps a discussion about finances or vacation plans. Instead, Maria placed the box of documents she had found on the coffee table between them and watched his face carefully as recognition dawned. The conversation that followed would be dissected by lawyers, analyzed by psychiatrists, and debated by jurors, but Maria would never fully reveal everything that was said that night. What emerged during her trial was that James, when confronted with the evidence of his deception, had not shown remorse or agreed to leave quietly. Instead, according to Maria's testimony, he had become threatening, telling her that no one would believe her word against his, and that if she tried to expose him, he would make sure that both she and Sophia paid the price for her interference. James had underestimated the protective instincts of a mother who had already lost one husband and was not prepared to lose her daughter. When he stood up from his chair and moved toward Maria in what she perceived as a threatening manner, Maria was ready. The kitchen knife she had hidden beneath a couch cushion was in her hand before James could react, and in a moment of pure maternal fury, she struck. The medical examiner would later testify that James Walsh, alias David Thompson, had been stabbed 17 times. The number of wounds, the location of the injuries, and the evidence that Maria had waited several minutes before calling 911 all contributed to the prosecution's argument that this was not self-defense, but premeditated murder driven by rage and betrayal. Maria never denied killing the man she had married. When police arrived at her home that night, they found her sitting calmly beside James's body, the knife on the floor nearby, waiting for them to arrest her. She had made no attempt to flee, hide evidence, or create an alibi. She simply sat there, knowing that her life as she had known it was over, but believing that Sophia would be safe. During her trial, Maria's defense attorney tried to argue that she had acted in self-defense, that she was a victim of elaborate fraud and manipulation, and that any mother would have done the same thing to protect her child. But the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. Maria had discovered James's true identity days before the killing. She had time to consider her options, to contact authorities, to seek help from family or friends. Instead, she had chosen to take justice into her own hands, and under the law, that choice made her guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution painted Maria as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered her husband in a fit of rage, and then constructed an elaborate story about protecting her daughter to gain sympathy from the jury. They argued that there was no evidence James had actually harmed Sophia, no proof that he intended to do so, and no justification for taking a man's life based on suspicions and assumptions. What the jury didn't hear, because Maria's attorney advised against it, was the full extent of James's criminal history, the detailed plans he had been making with his accomplice, and the true nature of the threat he posed to Sophia. The legal system's rules about evidence and prejudicial information meant that the very facts that had driven Maria to kill could not be fully presented to the people who would decide her fate. Maria Santos was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. As the judge pronounced her sentence, Maria stood with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the trial, accepting her punishment without visible emotion. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences, secure in the knowledge that Sophia would grow up safe from the man who had planned to destroy her innocence. Now, 8 years later, with only hours remaining before her execution, Maria had one final request for the man who had become her spiritual guide and closest confidant. Father Michael Rodriguez was about to discover that sometimes the most profound acts of love require the ultimate sacrifice, and that the truth can be both a burden and a gift that changes everything we thought we understood about justice and mercy. But Maria's story was far more complicated than even Father Michael had initially understood. During their countless conversations over the years, she had revealed details that never made it into the courtroom, evidence that would have changed everything if the legal system had been designed to handle the full complexity of human motivation and moral choice. The first time Father Michael visited Maria on death row, he had expected to find either a hardened killer or a broken woman consumed by guilt. Instead, he found someone who spent her days tutoring other inmates, mediating disputes, and caring for women who had given up hope. Maria had become the unofficial mother figure of the women's death row wing, and even the most hardened guards spoke of her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, though Father Michael had planned to stay for only 30 minutes. Maria talked about Sophia, about the fear that had consumed her during those final days with James, and about the split-second decision that had cost her everything. But what struck Father Michael most powerfully was her complete lack of self-pity. She never once claimed to be a victim, never argued that she deserved mercy, never suggested that the system had treated her unfairly. Instead, Maria talked about forgiveness, about the peace she had found in accepting responsibility for her actions, and about her hope that Sophia was growing up surrounded by love and stability. She asked Father Michael to pray not for her own salvation, but for her daughter's happiness, for the family members who were raising Sophia, and even for James's family, who had lost a son and brother regardless of what kind of man he had been. Over the months and years that followed, Father Michael learned the full scope of what Maria had discovered about James Walsh and the network of predators he had been connected to. The phone call Maria had overheard wasn't just casual conversation. It was part of a larger operation involving the trafficking and abuse of children. James had been working with others to identify vulnerable families, single mothers who could be manipulated, children who could be groomed and eventually exploited. The evidence Maria had found in that hidden box included contact information for other predators, photographs of children from various locations, and detailed notes about potential victims. James hadn't just been planning to abuse Sophia, he had been using their home as a base of operations for a much larger criminal enterprise. When Maria killed him, she hadn't just protected her daughter. She had potentially saved dozens of other children from becoming victims. But this evidence had never been presented at Maria's trial. Her defense attorney, overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and working with limited resources, had focused on the immediate circumstances of the killing rather than investigating the broader implications of James's criminal activities. The prosecution, eager to secure a conviction, had no incentive to explore evidence that might justify Maria's actions or complicate their narrative of premeditated murder. Father Michael learned these details gradually, as Maria's trust in him grew, and she began sharing the full weight of what she had been carrying alone for 8 years. She told him about the sleepless nights when she wondered if she could have found another way, about the guilt she felt for taking a human life, and about the constant fear that James's criminal associates might target Sophia in retaliation for his death. Most painfully, Maria shared her anguish about Sophia's reaction to David's death and her mother's arrest. Sophia had loved the man she knew as Papa David, and his sudden disappearance from her life, followed immediately by her mother's imprisonment, had been traumatic beyond measure. The 7-year-old girl had no way to understand why her stepfather was gone, or why her mother had been taken away by police. Maria's parents, Sophia's grandparents, had taken custody of the child and made the decision to tell her that David had died in an accident, and that her mother was sick and couldn't come home. They believed, with the best of intentions, that protecting Sophia from the truth about David's real identity and Maria's actions was the kindest approach. Sophia grew up believing that her mother was mentally ill, that David had been a loving stepfather taken too soon, and that sometimes bad things happen to good families for no reason at all. This well-intentioned deception created an additional layer of torture for Maria. Not only was she separated from her daughter, but Sophia's memory of her was tainted by the belief that she had suffered some kind of mental breakdown that made her dangerous. During the rare supervised visits allowed in the early years of Maria's imprisonment, Sophia would sit across from her mother in the prison visiting room, confused and frightened by the institutional setting, unable to understand why the woman who had once read her bedtime stories was now surrounded by guards and locked behind steel doors. As Sophia grew older and the visits became less frequent, Maria watched her daughter mature through carefully worded letters and occasional photographs sent by her parents. Sophia was excelling in school, participating in dance classes, making friends, and developing into the kind of confident, happy child that Maria had always dreamed she would become. But she was growing up with a fundamental misunderstanding about her own history, about the sacrifice her mother had made, and about the true nature of the danger she had been protected from. Father Michael began to understand the depth of Maria's internal conflict. She was grateful that Sophia was thriving, proud of the young woman her daughter was becoming, and relieved that the truth about James Walsh had been buried deep enough that it couldn't harm Sophia's psychological development. But she was also heartbroken that her daughter would never understand the love that had motivated her actions, the desperate maternal instinct that had driven her to commit murder, and the ongoing sacrifice she was making by allowing Sophia to believe a lie about who her mother really was. The complexity of Maria's situation was compounded by the reaction of James Walsh's family. His sister, Carol Walsh, had attended every day of Maria's trial, maintaining that her brother was innocent of the charges that had led to his previous convictions and that Maria was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered an innocent man. Carol had launched a public campaign declaring James's innocence, claiming that he was the victim of a justice system that persecuted men unfairly, and a woman who had been consumed by jealousy and rage. Carol's version of events painted James as a loving stepfather who had been trying to help Maria heal from her first husband's death, only to be betrayed and murdered by a woman who couldn't handle the normal challenges of blended family life. She had organized letter-writing campaigns to the governor, asking for Maria's execution to be carried out swiftly, appeared on television programs discussing the case, and created a website dedicated to her brother's memory that portrayed him as a martyred family man. The existence of this alternative narrative created yet another burden for Maria to carry. She knew that Carol genuinely loved her brother and had no knowledge of his true criminal activities. James had been skilled at compartmentalizing his life, presenting different faces to different people, and ensuring that his family saw only the carefully constructed persona of a grieving widower trying to rebuild his life. Maria understood Carol's pain and anger, even sympathized with her loss, but she could never defend herself against the accusations without revealing truths that would destroy Carol's memories of her brother and potentially put Sophia at risk. Father Michael found himself struggling with his own conflicted feelings about Maria's case. As a man of faith, he believed in redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility that even the most broken souls could find peace with God. But he also believed in justice, in the importance of protecting innocent children, and in the moral complexity that sometimes made it impossible to clearly distinguish between right and wrong actions. During their conversations, Maria would often ask Father Michael what he thought she should have done differently. Should she have trusted the legal system to move quickly enough to protect Sophia? Should she have taken Sophia and disappeared, becoming fugitives rather than risking a confrontation with James? Should she have tried to gather more evidence, to build a stronger case that authorities couldn't ignore? Father Michael found these questions impossible to answer definitively. In the abstract, he could argue for legal solutions, for faith in institutional justice, for the importance of working within established systems rather than taking the law into one's own hands. But when he looked at Maria, when he thought about 7-year-old Sophia and the very real danger she had faced, when he considered the networks of predators that operated in the shadows while legal processes moved at bureaucratic speeds, the moral calculations became much more complex. What haunted Father Michael most was his growing understanding that Maria's choice had been effective in ways that legal intervention might not have been. James Walsh's death had ended his criminal activities immediately and permanently. His associates, deprived of their local contact and concerned about increased attention from law enforcement, had apparently disbanded their operation and moved on to other locations. The children James had been targeting, not just Sophia but others in their community, had been protected by Maria's actions in ways they might not have been if the case had proceeded through normal legal channels. This realization forced Father Michael to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the adequacy of legal systems to address every form of evil. He had always believed that patience, faith, and proper procedures would ultimately triumph over wrongdoing, but Maria's case suggested that sometimes immediate action, even terrible action, might be the only way to prevent greater harm. As Maria's execution date approached, Father Michael found himself dreading not just the loss of someone he had come to consider a friend, but the weight of the secret knowledge he carried. He knew things about James Walsh that had never been revealed, understood the full scope of the threat Maria had eliminated, and recognized the ongoing sacrifice she was making by allowing her daughter to believe a comforting lie rather than a devastating truth. The final months of Maria's life were marked by an increasing sense of urgency about Sophia's future. Now 15 years old, Sophia was approaching adulthood with no understanding of her real history, no knowledge of her mother's sacrifice, and no preparation for the complex truth about the man she remembered as Papa David. Maria began to wrestle with the question of whether Sophia deserved to know the truth about her past, even if that truth might be painful and destabilizing. It was during one of their final conversations that Maria made the request that would haunt Father Michael for years to come. She asked him to carry a message to Sophia, but not immediately. She wanted him to wait until Sophia turned 18, until she was legally an adult, capable of making her own decisions about how to process and respond to the information Maria wanted to share. The message Maria wanted delivered was complex and carefully constructed. She wanted Sophia to understand that her mother had loved her enough to sacrifice everything for her safety, that the man Sophia remembered as Papa David had been dangerous in ways a child couldn't comprehend, and that Maria's actions, while legally wrong, had been motivated by a mother's desperate need to protect her child from a predator who had deceived them both. But Maria also wanted Sophia to know that she didn't expect forgiveness, didn't want her daughter to carry guilt about her mother's fate, and hoped that Sophia would continue to live the happy, successful life she was building without being consumed by the darkness that had touched their family so briefly but so devastatingly. Father Michael understood that accepting this responsibility would burden him with an enormous moral weight. He would become the keeper of secrets that could transform Sophia's understanding of her own life, the bearer of truth that might heal old wounds or create new ones, and the final link between a mother's love and a daughter's need to understand her own history. As Maria's execution date arrived, Father Michael realized that her final request represented more than just a dying woman's wish to communicate with her daughter. It represented a test of his own faith, his own understanding of mercy and justice, and his own willingness to serve as an instrument of love, in a world where love sometimes required impossible choices and devastating sacrifices. The morning of Maria's execution dawned gray and cold, with autumn rain tapping against the windows of the prison chapel where Father Michael had spent the night in prayer and contemplation. He had been through this ritual before with other condemned inmates, but never with someone whose case had challenged his fundamental beliefs about right and wrong so profoundly. As he prepared to spend Maria's final hours with her, Father Michael carried the weight of her request like a stone in his chest. Maria appeared calmer than Father Michael felt as they sat together in the small visiting room reserved for final spiritual consultations. She had spent her last weeks writing letters, not seeking clemency or proclaiming her innocence, but expressing gratitude to the people who had shown her kindness during her 8 years on death row. She had written to guards who had treated her with dignity, to fellow inmates who had become like sisters to her, and to the prison librarian who had helped her earn her college degree through correspondence courses. But the letter she handed to Father Michael that morning was different from all the others. It was sealed in an envelope marked for Sophia on her 18th birthday, in Maria's careful handwriting. The envelope felt heavier than its contents should have warranted, weighted with years of love, regret, and desperate hope that a daughter might someday understand the choice her mother had made. "Father Michael," Maria said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I need you to understand what I'm asking of you. This letter contains everything I want Sophia to know about why I made the choices I made. It explains who David really was, what he was planning to do to her, and why I felt I had no choice but to stop him the way I did." She paused, looking directly into Father Michael's eyes with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see into his soul. "But I'm not just asking you to deliver a letter. I'm asking you to help Sophia process the truth about her past in a way that won't destroy her future. I'm asking you to be the bridge between the mother she remembers and the woman she's about to discover I really am." Father Michael nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. The responsibility felt enormous, life-changing not just for Sophia, but for himself as well. Maria continued, her voice growing softer but more urgent. "Sophia is 15 now. In 3 years, she'll be 18. legally an adult, old enough to make her own decisions about what she wants to know and how she wants to respond to it. I've watched her grow up through letters and photographs, and I can see that she's becoming a strong, intelligent, compassionate young woman. She deserves to know the truth about her history, even if that truth is difficult. The hours that followed were unlike anything Father Michael had experienced in his years of ministering to the condemned. Instead of the usual prayers for forgiveness and peace, Maria spent her final time sharing memories of Sophia's childhood, describing the little girl who had loved fairy tales and believed that her mother could fix anything that was broken. She talked about Sophia's laugh, her curiosity, her kindness toward animals, and her dreams of becoming a teacher like her grandmother. But Maria also shared her fears about how Sophia might react to learning the truth about David and about the circumstances of his death. Would Sophia understand that her mother had acted out of love and desperation? Would she be able to reconcile the image of her mother as a protector with the legal reality of her as a convicted murderer? Would the truth heal old wounds or create new ones that might never fully close? As the afternoon wore on and the time for Maria's execution approached, Father Michael found himself making a promise that would define the next 3 years of his life. He would not simply deliver the letter and walk away. He would research Sophia's life, understand her circumstances, and find a way to present the truth in a manner that honored both Maria's love and Sophia's right to make her own choices about how to respond to it. The execution itself was carried out at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. Maria's final words were not a proclamation of innocence or a plea for forgiveness, but a simple statement that she died at peace, knowing that she had protected her daughter from a danger that others might never have recognized or understood. Father Michael held her hand as the lethal injection took effect, and felt the weight of her final request settle fully onto his shoulders. In the weeks and months that followed Maria's death, Father Michael began the delicate process of learning about Sophia's life without intruding on her privacy or alerting her family to his interest. He discovered that Sophia was thriving academically, excelling in literature and history classes, and had developed a passion for social justice causes. She volunteered at a local food bank, tutored younger students, and had been accepted into several prestigious colleges for early admission. Most importantly, Father Michael learned that Sophia had grown into the kind of person her mother had hoped she would become. She was confident but not arrogant, intelligent but not condescending, and possessed of a moral compass that led her to stand up for others who couldn't stand up for themselves. The tragedy of her early childhood hadn't broken her. Instead, it seemed to have instilled in her a deep empathy for others who had experienced loss and trauma. But Father Michael also discovered that Sophia carried questions about her past that her grandparents' well-intentioned deceptions hadn't fully answered. She had tried to research her mother's case online, seeking to understand what kind of mental illness could have driven a loving mother to commit such a violent act. The incomplete and often inaccurate information she found only deepened her confusion and, Father Michael suspected, her sense of guilt about being unable to help her mother during those final years. As Sophia's 18th birthday approached, Father Michael wrestled with the timing and method of delivering Maria's message. He had observed Sophia from a distance for 3 years, attending her high school graduation, watching her volunteer work, and even sitting in the back of the church during a youth group presentation she gave about helping families affected by incarceration. Each observation convinced him more deeply that Sophia was strong enough to handle the truth, but also that the truth would fundamentally change her understanding of her own life. The decision about when and how to approach Sophia was made for Father Michael by Sophia herself. 3 weeks before her 18th birthday, she appeared at the prison where he still served as chaplain, asking to speak with someone who might have known her mother during her final years. The prison receptionist, not knowing the full story, directed Sophia to Father Michael's office. When Father Michael opened his office door and saw Sophia standing in the hallway, his breath caught in his throat. She looked remarkably like Maria, with the same dark eyes and determined expression. But there was something else in her face that reminded him of the woman who had spent her final years helping other inmates find peace and purpose despite their circumstances. "Father Rodriguez," Sophia said, extending her hand with a maturity that surprised him, "I'm Sophia Santos. I believe you knew my mother, Maria Santos, before she died. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand some things about her that I've never been able to make sense of." Father Michael invited her into his office, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured toward a chair. The moment he had been preparing for over 3 years had arrived unexpectedly, and he found himself struggling to find the right words to begin a conversation that would change Sophia's life forever. "Sophia," he said finally, settling behind his desk while his mind raced through the possible ways to approach the truth, "your mother spoke of you often during our time together. She loved you more than you can possibly imagine." Sophia's eyes filled with tears at these simple words. "I know she did," she replied. "That's what makes it so hard to understand what happened to her. Everyone tells me she had some kind of breakdown, that she got sick in a way that made her dangerous. But that doesn't match my memories of her, and it doesn't explain why she never tried to contact me or explain herself before she died." Father Michael realized that this was the opening he had been both hoping for and dreading. Sophia was asking the right questions, showing that she was ready to hear answers that would be difficult, but ultimately healing. "Sophia, what if I told you that your mother never had a mental breakdown? What if I told you that everything she did was motivated by love for you, and a desperate need to protect you from a danger that no one else recognized?" Sophia leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from confusion to intense concentration. "What kind of danger?" Father Michael reached into his desk drawer and withdrew the sealed envelope that Maria had entrusted to him 3 years earlier. As he held it out to Sophia, he saw recognition dawn in her eyes. Her name, written in her mother's handwriting, seemed to call out to her across the years of separation and silence. "Your mother asked me to give this to you on your 18th birthday, Father Michael said. "But she also asked me to help you understand what it contains, and to be here for you as you process what you're about to learn." Sophia took the envelope with steady hands, though Father Michael could see the emotion building behind her composed exterior. "Before you open that, I want you to know that your mother died at peace, knowing that she had protected you in the only way she knew how. What you're about to read may change how you understand your past, but I hope it will also help you appreciate the depth of love that motivated every choice she made." Sophia opened the envelope carefully, as though it contained something precious and fragile. As she began to read her mother's final message, Father Michael watched her face go through a series of transformations, confusion giving way to understanding, anger dissolving into empathy, and finally, a kind of profound grief mixed with gratitude that he had seen only rarely in his years of counseling people through impossible situations. The letter Maria had written was masterful in its honesty and restraint. She explained David's true identity without graphic details, described the threat he posed without traumatizing her daughter, and took full responsibility for her actions while helping Sophia understand the impossible choice she had faced. Most importantly, Maria's letter emphasized that Sophia bore no responsibility for any of the events that had torn their family apart, and that her mother's greatest hope was that Sophia would continue building a life filled with purpose, love, and the kind of moral courage that helps others without seeking recognition or reward. When Sophia finished reading, she sat in silence for several minutes, the letter clutched in her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. Father Michael waited patiently, knowing that she needed time to absorb the magnitude of what she had just learned. Finally, Sophia looked up at him with eyes that seemed years older than they had been an hour earlier. "She saved me, didn't she? She saved me from something terrible. And then she let everyone believe she was crazy so I could grow up without knowing how close I came to being hurt." Father Michael nodded, his own eyes moist with tears for the woman who had died to protect her daughter, and for the daughter who was finally able to understand her mother's sacrifice. "Your mother was many things, Sophia, but she was never crazy. She was brave, loving, and willing to give up everything for your safety. That's not madness. That's the purest form of love I've ever witnessed." Sophia's response to learning the truth about her past was remarkably similar to her mother's response to discovering the truth about David. Instead of being consumed by anger or seeking revenge against those who had deceived her, Sophia channeled her emotions into a determination to honor her mother's memory by helping others who found themselves in similar situations. Within a year of her 18th birthday, Sophia had changed her college major from education to criminal justice, with a focus on protecting children from predators. She began volunteering with organizations that supported families affected by crime, particularly those dealing with the complex aftermath of situations where legal justice and moral justice didn't align perfectly. Sophia also made peace with her grandparents, understanding that their deception had been motivated by love and a desire to protect her from painful truths. She helped them understand Maria's real motivations and worked to ensure that her mother's memory was honored, rather than shrouded in shame and misunderstanding. But perhaps most remarkably, Sophia reached out to Carol Walsh, James's sister, and began a difficult but ultimately healing dialogue about the complex legacy of the man who had brought so much pain into both their lives. Sophia's compassion and willingness to acknowledge Carol's grief, while also sharing the truth about James's criminal activities, helped both women find a measure of peace with a tragedy that had affected them in vastly different ways. Father Michael continued to serve as Sophia's counselor and friend as she processed her mother's story and built her own life around the principles of protection, justice, and healing that Maria had embodied in her final years. He watched her graduate summa cum laude from college, attend law school, and eventually become a prosecutor specializing in cases involving crimes against children. Years later, when Sophia stood before her first jury as a prosecutor, arguing for justice for a child who had been victimized by someone who had gained their family's trust, Father Michael sat in the gallery and saw Maria Santos living on in her daughter's commitment to protecting the innocent. Sophia had taken the pain of her past and transformed it into a calling that honored her mother's sacrifice, while building a better future for other children who might face similar dangers. The story of Maria Santos and her final wish reminds us that love sometimes requires us to make choices that the world will never fully understand or appreciate. A mother's willingness to sacrifice her own life to protect her child, a chaplain's commitment to carrying a message across years of waiting, and a daughter's courage to face painful truths about her past. These acts of love create ripples that extend far beyond the individuals involved. Maria's last wish wasn't just about helping her daughter understand the past. It was about ensuring that future generations of children would have advocates who understand that sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as kindness, and that protecting innocence sometimes requires ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices. In the end, Maria Santos achieved something that the legal system couldn't provide: true justice that protected not just her own daughter, but countless other children who would benefit from Sophia's life work. Dear viewers, sometimes the most profound last wishes aren't about personal redemption or forgiveness. Sometimes they're about ensuring that love continues to grow and protect others long after we're gone. Maria Santos died knowing that her sacrifice would live on in her daughter's commitment to justice, and that the evil she had stopped would never touch another child's innocence. Her story challenges us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice to protect those we love, and reminds us that the greatest acts of heroism often happen in the shadows, unrecognized and unappreciated by a world that measures justice only by its adherence to rules and procedures.